זה ככה על פי עצובה, אבל בלילה כשהאורות קמים וכולם כבר הולכים, אני חולמת עליך ואני היחידה. Well, welcome to Afternoons with Steve. We have an exciting program today. The topic is racism, protest, and reform. We have two incredibly accomplished lawyers as panelists today. First of all, Patricia Holmes, who comes to us from Chicago, and Ruth Goba, who comes to us from Toronto. Welcome to the program, both of you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for including us.
Oh, my pleasure. So Patricia Holmes is the managing partner of Riley Safer Homes in Kansilla in Chicago. She's a former state court judge and a prosecutor. She's been involved with a number of high-profile cases as a lawyer, including, many of you will know, the case of the television actor Jussie Smollett. And she won it successfully, I should say, too. And we've defended cases together, and that's how I know Patricia. And most importantly, at least for me, Patricia is a dear friend. Ruth is equally accomplished, a former Ontario Human Rights Commissioner and the Executive Director of the Black Legal Action Center, and we're going to get into a little bit more in the discussion what that involves. But basically, it's mandated to combat anti-Black racism across the province of Ontario. And my connection to Ruth is that she's a former law student of mine at Osgoode Hall Law School in criminal procedure. So my first question to you, Patricia, is just about your background. You know, you are at the pinnacle of the legal profession in Chicago. Could you just tell us a bit about your background and any bumps that you had to overcome on the way to the top?
Sure. So I started my career in prosecution. I was what's called here an assistant state's attorney. So I worked for the Cook County State's Attorney's Office. The current state's attorney is Kim Fox, and so it was her office. She, of course, wasn't there, but Mayor Daley Jr. was the state's attorney when I first started in that office. And in that capacity, you're prosecuting basically street crime, murder, robbery, rape, even some other small things, you know, the neighbor who won't cut the tree down, and, you know, people who make too much noise at 2 o'clock in the morning, you know, those kinds of misdemeanors as well as major felonies. From there, I went to the United States Attorney's Office. So I was a federal prosecutor, and I prosecuted and tried scores of cases involving federal felonies. And so large-scale gangs, drugs, trafficking in child prostitutes, matters involving bank fraud or bank robberies, and other RICO types of cases, and large-scale prosecutions that you have to develop from scratch with the FBI, the DEA, the ATF, Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms, and other federal agencies, the Department of Treasury, etc. And from there, I was recruited by the city of Chicago to become what they call the Chief Assistant Corporation Counsel. And in that capacity, under Susan Scher, who you might know, or the name might sound familiar, she was the First Lady, Michelle Obama's first chief of staff. Michelle and I are friends, and Susan and I worked together in the city of Chicago as I was her chief assistant corporation counsel. And in that capacity, I ran all prosecutions for the city of Chicago. And from there, I was recruited to join the bench in Chicago as an associate judge of Cook County. And I sat for about 9 years on the trial court, trying cases, so hearing cases that were tried before me. And then I was recruited by my buddy and Steve's buddy, Ron Safer, who was a lawyer at a major law firm in the city of Chicago. And he recruited me to retire from the bench and join his firm in order to assist him with diversity initiatives as well as to try cases. And I did that for several years, and recently Ron Safer and I and several other folks left that firm and started our own law firm in 2016. And it's called Riley Safer Holmes and Cancilla, making me the only African American in the country, in the United States, whose name is on the door of a major law firm and who is also the managing partner. It's never happened before, and I'm the first one.
Wow.
So that's that's brings me to here.
Okay, wonderful. Okay, and Ruth, could you tell us about your journey? I know it didn't start in Canada. Where did it begin?
I was actually born in Washington, D.C., where my father was attending Howard University. He was originally from Sierra Leone, West Africa. At the age of about just under 2, my family moved to West Africa, and I lived there until I was about 6, I guess, for about 4 years. Came back here in 1977 and have been in Toronto ever since. I went to the University of Toronto. I did my undergraduate degree at the University of Toronto after dropping out of high school, actually, way back when there was grade 13 in Toronto. I left partway through grade 13 and I went to work, many of you will know Shoppers Drug Mart here in the cosmetic department, and was managing the cosmetic department in Shoppers Drug Mart, but always knew I wanted to go back to school. I ended up going back to school through the pre-university program at Woodsworth College at the University of Toronto. And I got into the University of Toronto and did a degree in political science, but I had a focus on African studies and international development. I, subsequent to that, applied to law school and got into law school. When I finished law school, I did not hear, you have to article. And that is basically working as an apprentice for a lawyer for a year to get practical experience. I didn't get an articling job and was very distressed about not getting the articling job, but it forced me to revisit the reasons that I had gone to law school, which were to work in international human rights and to work on issues of social justice. And so I decided that I would only look for jobs that I was absolutely interested in doing. And in so doing that, I found a job in India. I'd never been to India before, and it was a human rights job looking at, it required a law degree, but I was going to be looking at issues of property, inheritance, and the right to housing for women in India and Southeast Asia. And so I called the Law Society to say, I'm not going to article, I'm going away to India to work. And what happened was a blessing in disguise. The person that I spoke to happened to be the head of articling at the Law Society. And she said, well, actually that qualifies as articles. So I got, after not getting an articling position, I think I probably had the best articling position of my class because of the wonderful experience I had. I got to travel all over to Kenya. I got to do some work at the United Nations because I was working for the Special Rapporteur on Adequate Housing. Subsequent to that, finished the position there and came back here and finished articles at a place called Arch Disability Law Center, which was a community legal clinic, a sister clinic actually of the one that I'm at now. Went into, from there, went to a human rights organization that worked on domestic and international human rights in housing. So again, working in poverty law and social justice. Was in private practice for a short time, also working on issues of human rights. I've always only worked on issues of human rights in my career, and was appointed to the Human Rights Commission to sit as a commissioner in 2006. I was there for 11 years, and in 2015, when Barbara Hall retired as chief commissioner, the province appointed me to sit as interim chief commissioner. So I did that for just about a year, and then went on to the Human Rights Tribunal, where I sat as an adjudicator for a little over a year, and then ended up at the Black Legal Action Center in June of 2018. Someone sent me the job description for the Black Legal Action Center, and it felt a little bit like my whole career, because of all the work I'd been doing. I'd always worked on issues of anti-Black racism in whatever capacity, had led me to this place. And I applied for the job and got it, and here we are.
Okay. So Patricia, I want to take you to a moment almost exactly 6 weeks ago. It seems like much longer, but it is 6 weeks ago, when that video emerged of the police officer in Minnesota for 9 minutes, 9 long minutes, with his neck on with his knee, I should say, on the neck of George Floyd, while 3 police officers stood by and did nothing. And eventually, George Floyd was killed by that officer. And I just wanted to see if you can just recapture for us what it was for you to watch that video and see that man killed in the way he was.
Well, you know, when I saw the video for the very first time, I couldn't believe it. At first, I thought it was possibly, you know, something that someone had put together and tried to, you know, incite, you know, anger. And so I went searching on social media and then saw it on television and thought, oh my God, that is horrific. It was cold, it was callous. It was just unbelievable, just unbelievable. And to think that it was police officers who were treating someone like this, didn't matter what he did. You know, he deserved better treatment than that. He deserved a trial. He deserved to be arrested and brought to justice, no matter what it was. And then when I found out that he had been accused of passing a counterfeit $20 bill, I thought, oh my God, you've got to be kidding me. And the callous way that the other officers sort of stood by while the one officer had his knee on the man's neck and a hand in his pocket, which even showed more callousness. And, you know, it was just an inhumane way for that young man to die. And it reminded me of, you know, my involvement in Laquan McDonald. You know, that kind of thing that a police officer does, that you say to yourself, what are they thinking? What are they thinking at that moment that they would do something like that? My heart ached. And when I saw the full video, I actually just cried. It was just terrible.
Patricia, some of our viewers may not be familiar with Laquan McDonald. I know that it was a national case in the United States. Can you just briefly describe what that was and your involvement as a special prosecutor?
Sure. There was a young man who had sort of a mental illness, but had been a troubled teen, who had been arrested by police and released, and was sort of walking down the street, and someone called the police to say that they thought he was breaking into trucks. And so the police arrived and saw him. There were 2 or 3 different cars. They arrived, they see him, and they sort of track him, trying to talk to him. And he walks into the middle of the street, and several police cars are coming from different areas. There had to be 7, 8, 9 different police cars. And he's walking away from the police officers, attempting to get away, and he pulls a 3-inch knife. It's sort of like a little pocket knife, and they shoot him 16 times. He's not close enough to touch anybody or do anything, or to cause harm to the officers, but one officer puts literally 16 bullets into his body. And it was captured on video, much like the George Floyd video. And it caused all kinds of ruckus in the city. And I was asked by the chief judge of our courts to be a special prosecutor to investigate whether the officers were justified in that shooting. And it was it didn't rise to the level of the George Floyd, but I think it's right up there in terms of intensity. And I think that, the United States, we just weren't in a position to focus on those issues like we are now. So similar kind of intensity, but just not the same kind of focus at the time.
Yeah, I just want to ask you one follow-up question before I turn to Ruth, Patricia. And what is in common, besides obviously the brutality of the killing in each case, is that both of them were captured on video. And it's interesting because the New York Times columnist Nicholas Kristof wrote that if there hadn't been a video of George Floyd's killing, we likely would never have heard of him. It would have been covered up by the police. There would have been false arrest reports prepared, and it would have just fallen by the wayside. Do you think that really the power of the video, the power of the videotape, is what is making the difference in these cases?
Oh, absolutely, absolutely. I cannot even begin to tell you how many times I think to myself, back when I was a state prosecutor, back when I was a federal prosecutor, you would hear people say things, defendants, they would say, well, the officer hit me, or he held his gun to my head until I confessed. And you'd be kind of like, yeah, who would do that? No police officer would do that. And you think to yourself that people who put on the uniform and pledge to serve and protect would be good people, and that's what they would do. They're there to serve and protect. And for the most part, that's true. But just like all people, there are good police officers and there are bad police officers, just like there are good people and there are bad people. People who have a different view of their power and who don't necessarily exercise that power in the ways that we anticipate they ought to. And so without the videotapes actually showing, and there have been so many of them, just so many of them, but without those videos, it's the word of someone who is deemed to be a criminal versus the word of someone who is wearing the badge of a star and is presumed to be there to serve and protect. And without the video evidence, I think Mcdonald's case would have just been another, armed robber who was shot. And without the videotape, George Floyd's case would be the same. It would just be someone else who, quote, resisted the police and then in a struggle was inadvertently, killed in the line of the police officers protecting themselves. I think that's how it would have gone without that video evidence. Cell phones have really helped give rise to and showcase some of the ills that are taking place across our country. And it's taking place everywhere, so it's not isolated.
Ruth, turning to the George Floyd killing by the police, of course, that happened in the United States, it happened in Minnesota, but it clearly had an effect in Canada. The very minimum, we had protests in the city of Toronto. We know that it was a major news story here. Do you also think that it had the effect of opening some people's eyes to the fact that the racism that Black people have to suffer through in our province and in our country?
Absolutely, it did. And I will say, when I saw the video, I was sickened. I was extremely sad. I wasn't really surprised by it, to be honest with you. And I was actually grateful that it was caught on video. I think that although it happened in the States, the outpouring of support and interest in and understanding of the relationship of the Black community with police in Canada has, I think, is the result of, recognizing the humanity in George Floyd. One of the things that I talk about a lot at Black, in the context not just in policing, but in education, in housing, in all areas, in all sectors for the Black community, is a real failure to, or an inability to recognize the humanity in Black people. And this is particularly fraught in respect of policing. What we saw in George Floyd was someone who was extremely vulnerable, actually, who was pleading for his mother, who was begging for breath. And I think everybody could relate to him as a human being, as a vulnerable human being who was being brutalized, as opposed to what would have been the narrative, which was, had the video not existed, which was a violent, aggressive criminal that had to be subdued. And that attribution of those characteristics, I believe, would have come from his Blackness, right? Which is why we are here today. I think that it resonated across the globe, but it resonated in Canada because the issues that happen in the States happen in Canada too, right? And at Black, I'm dealing, and our staff are dealing with these sorts of issues all the time. We receive calls from across the province from people who are who are dealing with the impact of anti-Black racism. And I can tell you that in policing, often, what we see is patterns. And absent videotape evidence, it's exactly what Patricia said, is you have the stature and authority of a police officer who is deemed to be, an upright, upstanding citizen, versus someone who is alleged to be a criminal in the context of policing, right? And proving that something has gone wrong, that the police officer has acted inappropriately, is extremely challenging to do, right? Because the credibility is automatically attributed to the police officer. But with respect to how the protests in Canada, I think that in Canada, I mean, if, within the last month, we have had Regis Korchinski-Paquette, who died in the presence of police officers. We've had DeAndre Campbell, who his family called for assistance and he was shot dead. We've recently had the case of Defonte Miller, who in an interaction with off-duty police officers lost an eye. And this is common. I say that it's more, I think it's more racism, and how the Black community is treated in Canada is more covert, but it's just as pervasive, if that makes sense to you.
And so when we're talking about patterns of discrimination against Blacks, another way of describing that is systemic racism.
Yes. Yeah.
So the patterns of discrimination, just to distill it further, are we just talking about police stops? Are we talking about use of force by police? Or is it a combination of a number of things?
It's a combination. I mean, the Human Rights Commission recently released a report called A Collective Impact. And it was an inquiry, interim inquiry into the relationship of the police with the Black community. And what it revealed was that, Black people in in the city or in the province are 20 times more likely to be killed by police than their white counterparts. It revealed that there is a 70% chance likelihood that police will use force against a Black person. And so, you know, when you talk about systemic racism and you think of the percentage of the population that is Black as opposed to those numbers, 20% and 70%, you see that there is a significant disparity in how the Black community is treated by police.
Patricia, I want to turn to the protests because the protests have been record-breaking, particularly in America. I'm not sure about Chicago. You can speak to it, but I'm quite confident that you've had significant protests in your city. But what's been the response of the police and what's been the response of city government to the protests? Have you sensed that there's some genuine interest in changing things, or is it just a matter of letting people vent and moving on to the next episode?
So I think it's a mixed bag, and here's why. Typically, protests involve the aggrieved, right? The one group that is aggrieved. And so your typical protest, if it's African Americans, will be a group of African Americans. But I don't think the government knows what to do with the fact that in this particular protest season, so to speak, it's not just the aggrieved, it's allies also. So you've got white and Black and brown and yellow. Everybody is protesting. And so the government doesn't really know what to do with that. It's like, oh, wait a minute. On one hand, they want to treat the protesters poorly. They want to treat them as what they're called thugs, right? But at the same time, you then would have to treat white women in that same way. And the juxtaposition of those two things just doesn't go together for them. So they don't know what to do. They don't know what to do with Black Lives Matter because of the name, Black Lives Matter. And so they want to try and lump everything into something negative and bad, but they can't, because what they're finding is that the protesters, the true protesters, have been peaceful. It is the true thugs, or it is the true folks who are trying to disrupt, the disruptors, the bad disruptors, who are the ones that they're catching, starting the fires, breaking windows, inciting the riots. And so I think that the government here just doesn't know what to do with that. In Chicago, they went wild. There were protests every single day. But what you found is that the Black Lives Matter protesters and people who were protesting against police brutality were protesting peacefully. And then at nighttime, they would go home, and then you would have those people who would come in and kick up the ruckus, as they say. And so they were getting arrested. Then what they found is that the people who they were arresting were actually good people who were trying to be heard. So I think what has happened is that because the protests were not just in Minnesota, they spread throughout the United States, they spread throughout Canada, Germany, Australia, they were everywhere, London. I think it made not just government, but business started to listen, because business started to say, whoa, wait a minute, you know, we need to pay attention because this could impact us. And for government, same thing. We need to pay attention because this is impacting us. And then you had film after film, video after video after video that followed George Floyd, showing that that wasn't an anomaly. It wasn't just a one-off. This is happening all over in a variety of different places. And I think that meant to the government, we have to pay attention. And so what you see now is that they're trying to figure it out, particularly after they issued the curfews and people ignored them. You know, typically you don't ignore the government, but they ignored the curfews and they stayed out anyway and they protested anyway. And so I think things are on the brink of changing as long as the pressure stays tight.
That's a good segue to my next question. And Ruth, I'm going to be asking you this question as well, and it's an important one. President Obama was asked about his view of this massive protest movement. And he said that it was an awakening. That was his word, particularly among young people, and not just a moment. And the distinction is important. And really what I'm asking is, where will we be not just 1 week from now, 1 month from now, Patricia, but a year from now, 2 years from now? Do you think that this moment is that transformative, that it has the potential to shake up the racism that's so embedded in American and to some extent in Canadian society as well?
Absolutely. And I tell you why. You know, after several of the um, publicly notorious police shootings and killings, you know, there would be some ruckus, there would be a protest. You know, you would find folks come out and they would, complain, and people would say, what a shame. We've got to stop this. It's over. You know, the NAACP, the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People here in the United States, came out with a slogan recently, and they said, "We're done dying." And that caught on. And I think what is occurring right now is that you have a generation, and the millennial generation, the Gen Z generation, have been raised by what I call the soccer moms. Those people who said everybody is created equal, you know, we all get a trophy if we play, let's all play together, you know, and those kids took it to heart. Racism is bad against anybody. We're not going to be racist. We're going to be inclusive. They went to diverse schools, or they had friends who are diverse. And so the younger generations are not standing for it. They aren't standing for it. They view life in a different way. Like my grandparents, you know, you get up in the morning, you go to work, you come home, you eat, you go to bed, you get up in the morning, you come home, you eat, you go to bed. That's not these kids in this generation. They want to travel. They want to explore. They want to get to know other cultures and other people. They view it as mean when you identify someone by their race. For instance, on television, if you hear the news talk, they always say a person versus a Black person. And if it's Black person, it means criminal. And if it's a person, then it's just an ordinary non-Black person. And kids these days don't stand for that. They don't like it. They don't want to hear it. And they don't want to be involved in it, of all races. And so while you still have kids who are being raised by racist parents, because they aren't born racist, right? They're raised by people who allow them or who train and teach them to be that way. The kids these days are not standing for it. They just aren't.
Yeah, I was thinking of something that your friend Michelle Obama once said, Patricia. She said, when they go low, we go high. But it sounds to me like the next generation is, when you go low, we're going lower.
I think that with the next generation is really all about trying to create equality and equity.
Right.
You know, that's what they've been taught, and they now have a louder voice, and they're speaking out more in different ways. Social media has given them a connection across the world that I didn't have growing up. My parents didn't have growing up. You know, it wasn't until in the 60s when it was televised how Blacks were being treated in the South, you know, with water hoses and dogs being unleashed. It wasn't until it was televised that the country said, oh my God, wait a minute, we can't have that. Now, they weren't quite ready to switch over, but there was change. And I think this is that moment. It was televised around the world that this callous police officer put his knee on a man's neck, for 9 minutes. I watched his funeral. And when the minister said, we're going to stay silent for the 8 minutes and 46 seconds that the police officer had his knee on this man's neck with his hand in his pocket, that was the longest 8 minutes and 47 seconds I've ever experienced. I stood in my kitchen watching on the television, and like every 30 or 40 seconds, I say, okay, that has to be it. Oh my God, you mean there's 5 more minutes left? Okay, that has to be it. And then I'd look at the clock. Oh my God, you mean there's more? He had his knee on his neck that much time? It is a long time, which just goes to show you how little he thought of that man's life as he pleaded for his mother and pleaded for air.
And you know, I'll say one other thing, Patricia, and see if you agree with me. Not only that, but also it had to occur to that officer, the other 3 officers there, that they weren't going to be accountable. They knew they were being videotaped. It was quite clear. It's quite plain.
Yeah.
Go ahead, videotape me. You know, no
Yeah.
problem. Nothing's going to happen. There won't be any consequences.
Qualified immunity, they don't care. Qualified immunity. You know, they know the buzzwords, they say the buzzwords, and nobody questions it. And they keep on going. And the more the police officers see a lack of accountability across our country, the more bold they get in terms of what's going to happen. Nothing's going to happen to me. If it didn't happen to him, it's not going to happen to me. And now I think they're starting to see that they will get prosecuted. They will get prosecuted.
All right, Ruth, I want to turn to you with this very important question. And we know that we had the head of the police force, the RCMP, reluctantly coming to terms with the fact that there is systemic racism in the police. So it's a very different situation here. Do you think that there's been an awakening in this country about the reality of systemic racism?
I hope that there has. I agree that the outpouring has come, and the frustration actually with what is happening to the Black community at the hands of police has come not just from the Black community. It has come from across all races and all people. I will say that that the issues, though, that the Black community face in Canada are not just related to policing, right? And so I take us back to 2015, when there was all over the papers discussions of carding and street checks, and there were newspaper articles all the time. It was all over the news here. The impact of carding on the Black community. There was legislative change and some reform, and carding, as we understood it, was stopped. But what happened for the Black community was nothing, really. And on the ground, the racial harassment by police that was happening before carding continued to happen, and it continues to happen to this day. So the language actually made no difference. And so what I say that because I hope that this is in fact an awakening, and that the recognition that the pressure that is currently on government to come to terms with the realities of Black life in Canada stays on. I hope that the pressure stays on, and I hope that government recognizes that there really has to be significant change in the status quo. But I want to reiterate that it's not just with respect to policing. It's across the board. It's in employment, where Black women make, are paid, I think, 3 times less than oh no, I'm getting that number wrong. I'm sorry. Where the income of Black women is significantly less than white men, where child poverty for the Black community across the country is 18%, but for Black and children of African descent, it is 33 and 47% respectively. It is in the education system, where kids are streamed into apprenticeship courses and general education instead of academic level courses that precludes their opportunities for future success, right? It is in healthcare where we're seeing now inequality that's exacerbated because of COVID, where Black people are severely impacted they have a much greater pandemic burden, right, as a result of COVID. And so I hope that it is an awakening, but I hope that it's not just an awakening with respect to policing. I hope that there is the recognition that anti-Black racism impacts all sectors of our society, and that it has to be dealt with across all sectors, right?
So Ruth, your group, the Black Legal Action Center,
Yes.
just in terms of how you function, do you address these features of discrimination and racism in the courts, in the media? How do you actually operate as an organization?
We do both. We're a community legal clinic, so we're funded by Legal Aid Ontario. So we have some limitations with respect to how we assist, but we are a clinic that we're considered a specialty legal clinic. We serve the province of Ontario. We provide, our mandate is to combat individual and systemic anti-Black racism across the province. And to do that, we both provide individual legal representation to low and no income Black Ontarians, but we also do public legal education. We do systemic work, law reform, test case litigation, and we have an intake line that allows people who are facing discrimination related specifically to anti-Black racism from across the province to call us and receive legal assistance. And then we also, part of our mandate is systemic work. So we recently brought an action in coalition with other clinics and other organizations against the city for the failure to ensure social distancing in the shelter system, where the impact of a failure to social distance, particularly for the Black community and the Indigenous community and other vulnerable people, were not being met. So we have a broad range of work that we do, but the intake line that we have really allows us to hear from people across Ontario who are facing issues of anti-Black racism, and we see in those calls systemic patterns, right? So we see when we receive calls from across the province from parents saying, my child is being streamed, they called the police on my child at school, and they didn't call the police on the child that he or she had an altercation with who wasn't Black. My child was criminalized, the other child wasn't. When we get those calls, not just one or two, but we get them from across the province, we know that there's a significant issue. When we hear in the media that 6-year-olds are being handcuffed by police in schools, we know that there are significant issues. So I reiterate that it's not just in policing. Policing is horrific because of the potential for significant violence and even death, right? As we've seen over the past few months. And dating back to the 70s, actually, in Canada, right, in Ontario. But there's a different type of violence that is perpetrated against the Black community around anti-Black racism in all these other areas.
Patricia, of course, George Floyd exposed racism on the part of the police, but just as Ruth has described, the impact of it is much broader than that, and is impacted on an enormous segment of American society. We can look at athletics, the impact on using, and it hurts me even to quote it, but I have to, the purposes of this discussion, the Washington Redskins football team. We've seen it in journalism. We've seen it in professions. We've seen it in corporations across corporate America. So it's really had that same kind of transformative effect that Ruth just described in the United States as well, hasn't it?
Absolutely. When you look at individuals not as people, as human beings, and look at them as something totally different simply because of the color of their skin, that it creates a problem. And I hope you don't mind me telling this quick story, but it helps to underline how it all happens. When people see you and don't assume that you're just like anybody else. But for those of you on the call, Stephen and I had a lunch planned with his son, Dylan, at a very nice restaurant. And I arrived at the restaurant and they were already there, but they were seated in an area that I could not see them from the front door of the restaurant. And I looked around the part that I could see and didn't see them, so I thought I was a little early. And I said, well, okay, I'll wait. Knowing that Stephen is always punctual, 5 minutes after the hour, I realized, something's not right. So I tried to call him, but I couldn't get a signal. So I asked the maitre d', have you seen a man and a little boy? He says, no. And I said, oh, okay. So I go sit back down and I wait a little while longer. I try to call. The guy comes over to me. He's like, now who are you waiting for? You've been here a long time. I'm like, well, I'm waiting on my friend. It's a guy and his son. And he's like, well, nobody's here. And he's basically trying to get me to leave. Stephen and Dylan, I think, then just like stand up and come out from behind this pole. I'm like, whoa. He's like, I was worried about you. Where have you been? I'm like, I've been here waiting for you. He's like, nobody came to tell me. And the guy's like, oh, is this who you're waiting for? Never crossed his mind that the person who I'm looking for is not Black. There was an immediate assumption that I'm looking for somebody Black simply because I'm Black. There's a man and a boy. Why didn't you say to me, well, could this be the man and the boy you're waiting for? Stephen, to his credit, did what allies do. He wanted to see the manager. He was upset about it because it was clearly a race-based issue. And I'm leaving out facts, but it was clearly a race-based issue given the place that we were in. And Stephen let them have it. He wanted to see the manager. He wanted to make sure I had a free dinner. He literally wanted them to get trained on race relations. Now, what does that do? It not only makes me feel better, right? Because my friend is taking up for me, but his son is watching his father and taking cues on how to act in those kinds of situations. That's what we're dealing with right now. We're dealing with children who are taking cues from their parents to do what's right and try and contradict and counter this preconceived concept that African Americans, simply by the color of your skin, are somehow different. I am a lawyer. My husband is a professional vice president of a university. My children all went to what you would call, the Ivy Leagues of Chicago kinds of schools. They all went to college. Yet every time my son gets in his car, I worry because he has been stopped for doing nothing except driving while Black. His skin is the weapon. He is a Black male in a car driving, doing nothing else. And he gets stopped all the time. And I've had to train him and teach him how to keep his hands on the steering wheel, what to say, how to push the button now that we have technology to put me on the call. So every time he gets stopped, he calls me. Mom, I just got stopped by the police. I say, good, let me listen. And several times I've been able to jump in and prevent them from doing something to a kid who's doing nothing. He's doing nothing. He's driving his car. He's not drunk. He's not smoking weed. He's not doing anything to cause it except wearing his skin.
I, can,
Yes, go ahead, please, Ruth.
can I add to that? So one of the things that we did at Black was put out a document called Know Your Rights, and it was for the protests. It was to support the protesters that were happening across Toronto after George Floyd. And I just want to add on to what Patricia is saying about the skin being weaponized, right? And so we put out this document, and it talked about your human rights, your constitutional rights, charter rights, with respect to what you can do in a peaceful protest, and how to behave, and what you're entitled to ask for if the police stop you, what you do if the police stop you. But we had to put a kind of a note at the top that said, we recognize that that for our community, for the Black community, that asserting your rights with police brings with it significant risk. And so, there was a case a few years ago about, it was the Neptune 4, and it was at the height of the carding that was happening in the city. And there were four young teenage boys, heading ironically in a TCHC project to a after-school learning program. And the police stopped them. And they did what everybody in the province was talking about, which was, if you're stopped, assert your rights. Ask why you're being stopped. Do you have to give your name? And they asserted their rights, and they ended up being assaulted and arrested, right? And if it wasn't for video in that case, the narrative in that case would have been much different, and those kids would have had criminal records, right? And so it is actually, I just want to reiterate that, for Patricia's son, it is exactly just the fact of being Black that criminality is attributed to you and danger is attributed to you. And so you have to be a little bit conscious as a Black person about how you behave, right? About how you react, because of the potential for danger for you and the potential for violence.
And it's not just young Black men, it's just
No.
Black men, period, in the United States. My husband is a Black man. And, last summer, and he's not, like a teenager. Last summer, he's all dressed up in a tuxedo on his way to a wedding. He gets in his car. He drives a big truck because he's a big guy. And he pulls into a car wash to have his car washed before he goes to the wedding. And the police come from out of nowhere, several cars. They yank him out of his car, throw him on top of the hot hood of the car. He's trying to ask what the heck is going on. And they're saying to him, well, this is a drug spot. What are you doing here? He's like, I'm trying to get a car wash. They take everything out of his car. He's a football coach. They throw it all on the ground looking for contraband. Of course, there's none. And then they just disappear, period. And leave him standing there with all the stuff all on the ground,
too, right?
humiliated, dirty in his tux. Now he can't get to the wedding. For what? Because he was a Black man driving what they considered to be a drug truck, a Yukon or whatever, and stopping to get a car wash. It's ridiculous. It's ridiculous. Would they have done a white gentleman like that? No.
Patricia,
And I tell you, I had some of the best white DEA agents, drug enforcement agents, who would do setups and buys. They were white because the cops never suspected. Never, ever, ever.
Yeah. Patricia, when I proposed this program to the rabbi of our synagogue, Beth Sholem, Rabbi Aaron, he immediately embraced it. And his view was that the struggle against anti-Black racism, or against racism against any vulnerable community is connected to the struggle against the scourge of anti-Semitism. And I'm just wondering if you see it that way, that there is a symmetry, that there is this link that links us both in the same battle.
Oh, absolutely, absolutely. You take a people who were annihilated by somebody who was just crazy, right? And a country that sat back and did nothing and just sort of joined in. And you say to yourself, how in the heck could that happen? But it did. And you analogize that to another group of people who are literally picked up from their country and brought, across the ocean to another country to work and slave and toil to make wealth in that country, and who are not allowed to read and learn and do anything, and who are treated like dirt. And it's the same thing. It's exactly the same thing, which is why I think that throughout time, particularly in civil rights, it has typically been the Jewish people who have been the allies of African Americans in the struggle for equality, and who have understood. The difference being, often the Jewish person has a skin color that is accepted quicker than the African American person. So the ability to infiltrate and the ability to talk across lines and get people to hear and understand you has been helpful in the African American struggle. But it literally, to me, is the same thing. It's the same thing. What gives any race of people, the right to lord it over another race of people, period, or to disrespect, annihilate, and dehumanize anyone.
Well,
And I think the time has come, to eradicate all of that.
yeah, well, the mute button is on, but I can assure you there's a chorus of amens going across the spectrum of the people who are watching and listening. The final message I wanted to be a message of optimism and hope for our viewers. And so my question to you, Ruth, first, to you, Patricia, is where are you optimistic about the future in eradicating anti-Black racism? Do you have any sense of hope that really is a realistic prospect?
I do, and I think I have 3 daughters. I have 3 young children, a 14-year-old, a 12-year-old, and a 10-year-old. And I see for them significant difference in how they view and understand the world, as opposed to when I was growing up. Whether it is issues related to anti-Semitism, whether it is issues related to anti-Black racism, disability, LGBT rights, an understanding of anti-Asian racism that's happening now as a result of COVID. They seem to have a better understanding of the unfairness and the inequity. And so, for instance, there's a social media platform called TikTok, and kids are on it, and my kids, are on it every so often, and it has changed since the killing of George Floyd. TikTok has evolved from a platform that was really about just kind of fun and dancing to a social media, to a movement. And everybody's icon says Black Lives Matter. The streaming is all about inequity and what can be done to fix the inequity. And so I see hope in our younger generations, and the pressure that they will put on government and business, right, to make real change. My husband actually is Jewish, and we spend a lot of time talking. My daughter does Ancestry. You asked a little bit about, can you equate the two, or can you see a connection between anti-Semitism and anti-Black racism? And I would say, she's doing Ancestry, and when we look at my husband's family and recognize that 90% of his relatives were killed in the Holocaust, and 90% of their ancestors were killed in the Holocaust, we are teaching them about humanity, right? And about equity and about privilege and about all of those things. And I think that that is a part of, I hope that that is a part of what comes out of this movement that we are seeing now as a result of George Floyd, not just in our home, but I think the frustration that people see, that people feel across the globe, I hope makes a significant difference in how future generations understand fairness, right? And humanity, I would say.
Well, before I turn to Patricia, you have a personal pledge for me that anytime you need me, I'm there for you, okay? So Patricia, let me turn that to you and ask you the same question. Are you optimistic at all about the future? Has George Floyd changed things in any kind of positive way for you?
Absolutely. It's conversations like this. And thank you all for allowing me to speak with you and to be here. But it is absolutely conversations like this that will change the world. These kinds of conversations weren't taking place widely, but now they are. People are reading more, and they're more open and receptive. I have been challenging people to read one book and watch two documentaries. The book is White Fragility by a woman named Robin DiAngelo. And the two documentaries are 13th and I Am Not Your Negro, which is based on the writings of James Baldwin. Two extremely critically acclaimed documentaries, and a book that is on the bestseller list, is sold out after George Floyd's killing. And then they're doing book clubs and conversations to talk about the issues that are being presented. And there are so many people. Right now I belong to so many book clubs where we're reading that one book and watching those two movies and having conversations across race lines, gender lines, religious lines, and the receptiveness that people have to hearing and trying to understand the plight of African Americans, the plight of other people who have been disenfranchised, is magnificent. And I think that 5 years from now, we're living in a totally different world. And I think that, at least in the United States, some of that will come after we have our election in November. That will say a whole lot about the direction in which we're going to go.
Well, Patricia, this program is being videotaped, and you're free to use it and distribute it as freely and widely as you want, if you think that it has a salutary effect. So what an inspiring message from both you and Ruth to end this program with. It's been fabulous. And I want to thank Patricia Holmes and Ruth for giving of their time and such incredible insight, such accomplished lawyers, and such and truly inspiring messages. And Patricia, I love you, so I have to say that. You're a dear friend. And I have great admiration for both of you. So I hope our audience has enjoyed this as much as I have. Thank you to both, and thank you from Afternoons with Steve. Be well.
And
thank you so much
very much.
Thank you so much for hosting this program.
Oh, my pleasure, Ruth.
Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you.
Bye, everyone.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.